caught it, but I was just live on Giri's YouTube channel, which just ended a minute ago. So I was in a bit of a hurry. But I have the coach stream prepared, of course. So it doesn't matter too much for me. But if you're already here, let me know in chat. And let's get this stream going. Let me find it myself as well, by the way. I thought that's everything set up. And we are live. So yeah, I wanted to start 2 minutes ago already, but I had some issue with the stream for some reason. But now I am live, which is great. So I'm not sure if you caught it, but I was just on the Giri's YouTube channel, so I was in a bit of a hurry, but now I'm here, and I hope you're able to catch this stream. Something is going wrong for me. Not sure why the stream is not running. Yeah, I think it is running. I didn't see it yet for myself in the YouTube, but now it's running. Or at least I think so. I couldn't find the stream myself. Let me check if it's running. For some reason, it's not popping up. I think I'm live. I'm not able to read chat, but I think I'm live, so that's already good. Yeah, it's saying I'm live, and now I'm able to see it myself. Yeah, so sorry for the hassle. I couldn't see the stream myself. Some stuff was going on, but now it's fixed. And yeah, I hope everyone caught the stream with Anish. That's where I came from. So I was in a bit of a hurry. Suddenly I had some tech issues. I'm not sure what was going on there, but let's go to today's session. It's about beginners openings for black. So we're gonna watch it from the black side of the board, and I'm gonna turn it around. So let's start a little bit with the basics. Usually when you're playing in the opening, doesn't matter which side, but the general rules are a bit that you start by putting a pawn in the center. So let's say your opponent goes 1d4. You usually push 1d5, because you get a pawn in the center, you grab some space, and after you've put a pawn in the center, you want to start developing your knights, get your bishops out, and then castle to safety. So what is, for example, a very common strategy here with black is, for example, c4. You want to keep the pawn in the center, so we go c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3. And then we play e6 to start developing the bishop as well. And for example, after moves like e3, knight d7, queen c2, bishop d6, followed by castle, we have a very harmonious setup. So this is the way you want to start in the openings. This is very beginner. This is a short introduction to illustrate how you, for example, can play. But let's also go into a bit more of details. You can play the opening in a lot of different ways, and in the beginning position there are 4 main moves that white in general plays. The main most played moves are e4 and d4, but also c4 is a very common move, and one knight f3. All developing moves, grabbing space in the center, and we all gotta take care of them. And what I would usually do if I would be teaching a beginner is to advise them to play the King's Indian defense with black. It's something you can be using against one knight f3, one d4, and one c4. So it will cover all of those 3 moves, and you only need something extra against one e4. So it's very nice to have that. So let's get a little bit into the King's Indian. So it starts, for example, with 1d4. And the setup you want to choose with black is not to put a pawn in the center. You're gonna delay that for a while, but you're first gonna develop your knight. So we play knight f6, and the setup we want to choose here is to play g6, followed by bishop g7 and castle. And then we'll see what white has done in the meantime, and after that we will develop our other pieces as well. So usually white grabs some more space with the move c4. We play g6. We just continue our development, bishop g7. And here we have something important. White is grabbing a lot of space, and usually you don't really want to give your opponent that much space. So the thing is that we lure white forward so that afterwards we can start attacking his center, and there will be some weakness in the position. What you usually have is that, okay, if a pawn moves forward, it grabs some space, but it also creates weaknesses behind the pawns. So eventually there will be some weaknesses. Also, maybe, for example, d4 with the bishop on this diagonal could become weak. But we'll see about that later. In this position, we do not really want to allow white to get even more space in the center, so we usually play d6. And after knight f3, we finish our, or almost finish our development with the move castles. And now we've got a very, very decent setup. And the thing about this setup is that we can be using it against a lot of different opening setups. So as I already mentioned, we could use it against 1d4, 1c4, and 1 knight f3. So let's have a look at, for example, 1c4. So against 1c4, we can play knight f6, knight c3, and again g6, and we're going for the same setup. But now white can go for something a little bit different. He can start to play with e4 here, and again he's trying to play e5. So we're trying to prevent that, and we play the move d6. Just to also grab some space ourselves. Now we get these squares, and after white pushes d4, we get the same position we had before. So we again play bishop g7, white plays a random move like knight f3, developing, and then we castle and we finish our development again. So yeah, we already finished our development, and then we're gonna have a look at how to play the position further. Let's have a look first at 1 knight f3. Here again I would say just play 1 knight f6, and after which you can play g6, bishop g7, castle. So it's a very, very harmonious setup for black, which can be used against a lot of different systems. And we'll get into the middle game a little bit later, but let's first have a look at 1 e4. And the reason why you cannot go for this King's Indian setup, which you would like to achieve, if you like the opening at least, with black. So the setup we were going for was to play knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and then castle. But the problem is that usually what you see after, for example, 1 d4, is that the move 1 knight f6 prevents white from grabbing even more space with e4. So that's really an upside with the move knight f6. And we saw later that white was grabbing the center with c4, and eventually got in this e4. But he had to play c4 first. So the reason why we do not mind white grabbing space with e4 this time is because he's already gone c4. White can, for example, also play 2 knight c3 to try and go e4 afterwards. But here in this position, I would say we can play d5, preventing the pawn to come to e4. And now actually the knight is a little bit city on c3. The thing is, usually you do not really want to put your pawns in front, or sorry, your knights in front of pawns, because you want to put pressure in the center. It does not, it's not a big problem that we put our pawn in front of the f7 pawn. In general, moving up your f pawn early on in the game is a bad idea. So placing your knight in front of the f pawn is not such a big deal. However, white in general in these positions where there's a pawn on d4 and d5 would like to play c4. to put pressure on our d5 pawn and also grab some space on the queen side. But it's just very difficult to achieve with the knight on c3. It already has to move somewhere, and then takes a lot of time before white achieves c4. So that is why we are able to play one knight f6 and go for this setup. It seems a bit passive maybe, but the idea is later on to eventually play e5 or c5 and grab some space in the center, and white might still have a space advantage, but you can play around that. But we'll get more into that later on. But let's get to 1 e4, because usually it's not a great idea to play knight f6 here. The problem is that e4 has already been played, so we did not really prevent it, and but white can basically just push for e5 and grabbing space. We've already seen this before with the King's Indian, that we should not be allowing e5. And again, this is the problem here. Usually black continues with knight e5, and this is called the Alekhines defense, or Alekhines defense. And okay, even though it's more or less playable, white should objectively have a slight space advantage here, and due to that has a slight edge. Usually play continues with d4, d6, and here I like the move knight f3 a lot, just developing the pieces. And due to the pawn on e5 and d4, you have a slight space advantage, which secures an edge for white. You can definitely see that even if you don't, you can also treat this opening differently. You can definitely see that this knight f6, knight d5 maneuver gives up a lot of space. One thing I used to play a lot myself in this position for white was c4, knight b6, f4, grabbing a lot of space in the center. And here white is also slightly better, so it's not a good idea to give up that much space. So again, against 1 e4, I would play differently. I think the most promising lines against 1 e4 are usually when you're trying to grab space in the center with a pawn. So what is the most common reply to e4 is 1 e5. It's the most logical. It helps you develop the bishop, and also you're grabbing space in the center. Also, you're copying your opponent. What I used to remember from my youth was that everyone just played 1 e4, 1 e5, and 1 d4, 1 d5, just copying the other player. So definitely, if you're a beginner player, I think you will very often see e4, e5. And I think it's a very respectable way to play. It gives even the top grandmasters a very big headache these days. That is mainly due to the Berlin. So what usually is played here is, again, we're trying to follow the strategy. First put a pawn in the center, then develop your knights, and then get the bishop out, followed by castling. So what happens very often is knight f3. Knight f3 is definitely the most critical move in the position. Developing the knight, but also putting pressure on the black center. Usually black develops a knight and protects the pawn. And what you will see very often here is that white will either play the move bishop c4 or the move bishop b5. Both with different ideas, and both being deployed at the highest level of the game. This is featured in so many top grandmaster games. So it's definitely something that happens on every single level. The idea behind bishop b5 is at some point to take on c6, after which you take back and then take on e5. But here's one mistake a lot of beginners are making, and one that I made myself. The first ever time that I was looking at theory of the Spanish, I was actually playing one of our other coaches, Sophie Huttel. Sorry if I mispronounced the name, but Sophie Huttel. And in that game, I made the move knight f6, which is called the Berlin, but I mixed up the move orders. I think she castled, and then I played the move a6. But this allowed her to win a pawn by just grabbing on c6 and grabbing on e5, winning a pawn. So this was because I forgot the move order. The thing in these positions is that very often the beginner mistake that is made is that black thinks that white is already threatening to take on c6. So what you'll very often see beginners do in this position is to play d6 just to protect the e5 pawn. But this is a little bit passive because you would rather grab more space. Now white can just play d4 and has a nice space advantage and a development lead. So the thing is that in this position you should try to make sure use of that white is not threatening to take on c6. And you can play knight f6, which is the Berlin, but I think a6 is a more natural move, because after bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e5, we have the move queen to d4 with a double attack on the knight and on the pawn, and we will win back the pawn. For example, knight f3, we play the move queen takes e4, we check, after which we have an open position with the bishop pair, and this means that we have a nice position in general and we are doing great. So actually white is not at all threatening to take on c6 followed by knight takes e5, and usually just plays bishop to a4 in this position, after which we now develop the knight. And because we have included the moves a6 and bishop a4, at some point we can play the move b5. If you compare it to the previous position we had, this position, if you had a look at the game I had against Sophie, what happened was that here I played a6, but now we cannot go for this with queen d4 because the king is already out of the center. So after knight to f3, queen to e4, it's not with a check, and we're going to lose the game after the move rook to e1, and the queen is just pinned. So this can happen at the very beginner levels, and you should first start with the move a6 and then try to develop your knight. It's one of those openings in which you can end up in a lot of trouble very quickly. So it's very good to know how to deal with this. And after the move knight f6, castles, we are attacking the e4 pawn. Instead of taking it, I would advise you to just play bishop to e7, developing another piece, trying to get the king out of the center next. Again, white is not really threatening to take because the e4 pawn is under attack. So after knight takes e5, we can just play knight takes e4. And we again have the bishop pair in an open position, so we are at least fine here for sure. So we played the move bishop to e7 with the idea to castle. White protects the e pawn, and now he is threatening to take on c6 followed by knight takes e5. So this is also sometimes a thing that I see happening in one of my own games. If I play this from the white side, is that people just finish their development with castles. But the problem is that, as I said, we were threatening to take on c6 followed by knight takes e5. So it's definitely something you have to remember, that you first should play in this position the move b5. And that is why you play a6 earlier on. Now after bishop b3 we go castles. We finish our development. We were trying to play d6 followed by developing our bishop to some square and have a good position. This is something you really got to be careful of when you're playing from the black side. That you're not getting lost in 5 or 10 moves. If you do something wrong with black in the opening, you can definitely end up with a very, very bad position. So it's something you gotta really be careful of. You gotta finish your development. In general, do not try to grab pawns as early as possible, and do not move your pieces twice. Here, this is a very good way to develop because we've only moved our pieces once. In this position we can also play d6 by the way, but the idea is just to move each piece once. We have only played the knight once, the other knight once, the bishop once, all the pawns we've only moved once, and that makes sure that we get a decent position. So try to first put a pawn in the center, then develop your knights, get your bishops out, and then castle to safety. But try to also take care of that you only move your pieces once, because if you move them twice, if you for example play some random move like knight a5, you can already see the e5 pawn is dropping. So just develop them once and then you're fine. We could also see this in the King's Indian. Like here we develop our knight, then we try to develop our bishop. We only move each piece once and then we have a fine position. And let's get to the strategy of the King's Indian, because if you don't really know how to deal with these positions, it can be a bit tough, because you have a little bit less space, so you really should know how to play against that. But the idea was, as I mentioned before, that we can put our pawn in the center with e5. And usually in the King's Indian, what you will see is that you get this structure. And in this kind of close position, which we have arised in now, we should have a look at the pawn structure, the pawn chain. Our pawn chain is pointing towards this side. Our most forward pawn is the e5 pawn, so you should say that it's pointing towards this side and not the other way around. We should have a look towards our most forward pawn, and that the way this arrow is drawing is the side which we should be playing on. We have the most space on the king side, so we should be trying to play on the king side. While white has the most space on the queen side. His most forward pawn is the d5 pawn, which means that his pawn chain is pointing towards this side. We should have a look at the most centered pawns, so probably the d6 e5 pawn and the e4 d5 pawn. So black is going to the left side, white is going to the right side, and we should eventually be playing on the king side. Usually, instead of the immediate d5, what white plays is castles, after which ed4 is not a great move. You give up the center pawn. White has a space advantage now, but it's better to keep on develop your knight. Putting pressure on d4. White does not really want to deal with this pressure and moves his pawn forward, after which we retreat our knight, getting it already to the king side. And as I was already talking about the pawn chains, because it's becoming very important. Usually you want to go after the most backward pawn in the pawn chain. So let's say white plays knight to e1. He wants to play f3. So what you will see is that eventually you will start to attack the f3 pawn. And we want to attack the e4 pawn in this way. So the idea here is to play the move knight to d7, followed by f5. Let's say white plays bishop to e3. Then we start to play move f5. Usually they play f3 and then f4, grabbing more space on the king side and eventually going for the attack with g5. And this is the way to play in the King's Indian. You're trying to play as most on the king side, so aim for f5, then try to grab even more space and go for that king side attack. Usual plans are to play knight to g6, knight to f6, h5, g4, and eventually you want to crash through with g3 and just start to completely mate the king on the king side. White eventually will start to try and play on the queen side, and it's basically a race for who gets in the first. But it's a very, very interesting position. One thing I should probably point out is that after we play the move e5, white does not win the pawn. It seems like he can take the pawn. The problem always is that there's this bishop on this diagonal. So the usual trick we have in these positions is to play knight takes e4, opening up the diagonal for the bishop to attack the knight. And after knight takes e4, bishop e5, we have a very fine position. As this bishop is now becoming active, we can develop the knight, we can develop the bishop, and we don't have a space disadvantage anymore. So definitely a fine position. So something to keep in mind. We can also play the King's Indian in a different way, actually. Some setups which white can choose, it's better to go for a different pawn push. So as I mentioned in this position, one other idea is to go c5. And that resembles more the Benoni opening. So against d4 you have a lot of options. We might have a look at one d5 later on, but an opening that you can play against one d4 is the Benoni, and that arises after these moves. c5, hitting the center. White cannot really take because you will go e6, followed by bishop to c5. But after the move d5, grabbing some space, we go e6, trying to exchange the e pawn for the d pawn, for the c pawn actually. And after the move, let's say knight f3, e d5, c d5, d6. We have this kind of structure, and you will get to that kind of structure sometimes in the King's Indian as well. The idea is to go g6, bishop g7, and then castle, after which we have a very dynamic position, and a position that can result more or less from the King's Indian as well. So we get to this position, d6, and sometimes as I mentioned, it's an interesting idea to go c5. So for example here, it's a very interesting setup with bishop to e2. We castle again, finishing our development, or at least getting our king already to safety. Bishop to e3, and now we can hit this end with c5. Here, for example, e5 is also a very fine move. We get to this structure again where black eventually should be aiming to play f5. But c5 is also a very interesting move. White cannot really take on c5 because it opens up the diagonal. We can play the move queen a5 next, after which we are threatening to take back the pawn. And the problem for white here is that after c takes d6, knight takes e4, he's in a lot of trouble. So because there's just so much pressure on this knight. It's pinned by the queen, and it's attacked by the knight, it's attacked by the bishop, so it's gonna go wrong for white eventually. White cannot really take, so he pushes his pawn even further, grabbing some space, and now we go for this Benoni structure again. Now white continues developing, e d5, c d5, and we get this very interesting structure, one in which eventually black should be aiming to push for a6 b5. We put our rook to e8 and just finish our development eventually, and yeah, it's just a very dynamic position, not a symmetrical structure, and you can get this kind of structure also very often from the King's Indian. So I think the King's Indian is a very funky opening to play because it can lead to a lot of different positions in which you can try to go for mating attack, very unsymmetrical pawn structures. So it's one opening which I really liked, which was one of my childhood loves. I would put it that way. But let's actually have a look at something different. These days, what I also do is just put my pawn in the center, not giving white that space advantage, which white does want. A space advantage usually means that you have a side advantage in most games. Usually white puts some pressure on the center. And here there's a big decision. It seems like a free pawn, so definitely one very interesting move is just to take it. The problem is though that we are giving up the center. We don't have that d pawn anymore, which means that if we lose the c4 pawn, we might have a slight disadvantage. For example, if white goes e4 and we just play the passive move e6, white has a very, very nice position here. He has two pawns in the center and it's very easy to develop. So dc4 is not really a move I like. It's very playable. You need to play some different moves. I think the main move these days is e5. Very funky move, but dc4 is definitely playable, but I think the easiest way to play is actually the move e6. c6 is also a very, very decent move, but I like the move e6. And the reason for that is because it very often leads to the Carlsbad structure. The Carlsbad structure is a structure that arises after the moves knight c3, knight f6, cd5, ed5. And the Carlsbad structure is when there are pawns on d4 and d5, and the c pawn has been traded for the e pawn. So it seems like a symmetrical pawn structure, but it's actually not really the case. So what we what happens is that sometimes, for example, white can push for the e4 break and black can push for the c5 break. But the problem is that let's say white goes queen c2, a bit of a random move, but bishop b7 and white aims for that e4. The problem is that he's always going to be left with this isolated pawn on d4. It's not really something you want in general, to get an isolated pawn. It can very easily become weak because it cannot be protected by any other pawns. And in general, you should not fear the e4 break that much. But this is also the case for us. In general, white should not be unhappy when black goes for a c5 break. Let's say white develop his knight to f3, and we go c5. It's in general not such a big deal because, for example, white can take, and we are left with an isolated pawn ourselves. dc5 is not the best move here, but it's just trying to illustrate that once you go c5, you can very easily end up in isolated pawn positions, and you should be a bit careful before you end up in such positions, because the pawn can become weak. You need to know how to deal with these positions, but it's more of an endgame type of game. Instead, it's better to just put our pawn on c6 eventually. So white can, for example, play bishop g5 here. And usually what black does is just put the pawn on c6, so that after bishop takes f6, we can answer it with queen takes f6. Because in this position, if we, let's say, play the random move a6, then white can take on f6. We cannot take it back with the queen because we lose the pawn. But we do not really want to take back on f6 with the pawn, because our pawn structure is just really, really bad. So the thing is that we play the move c6. One thing that was taught to me when I was quite new to the game is that you can play the nice move knight to d7 here. And I don't really like this setup, but it's trying to lure our opponent into a very nice trick. It seems like the knight is just simply pinned, and white can just take the pawn, right? But the problem is that after knight takes d5, we can't take it back. The queen, the knight was pinned, but we have a counter trick. After bishop to d8, we have the move bishop b4 check. And the only legal move in the position is to go queen to d2. After which we can just take it, king to d2, king to d8, and we are just up a full piece with a winning endgame. So if you're feeling like your opponent is not that well known in these 1d4 positions, you might have a try with knight to d7 here, trying to trick your opponent into a losing endgame. Your opponent might be thinking, okay, I'm just winning the pawn here, but actually it's just a completely lost position. But in general, I like the move c6 here. Because I don't want to put our knight to d7 yet. We can do that later on, maybe. Usually white plays e3, and there will be a lot of maneuvering in these positions. I like the setup with bishop to d6, very active square, bishop to d3, castles, knight to e2, rook to e8, and we finished or are close to finishing our development, and a very interesting, very interesting game ahead. So this is definitely one other way to deal with 1d4. We have already had the King's Indian before, but now we have the Carlsbad structure, and very interesting game ahead. Still every single piece on the board. We don't have a space disadvantage, so that's good as well. And I'm gonna show a very nice game soon in this structure. But let's have a look at 1e4 again. Now we have two ways to meet 1d4, but let's also get some more options against 1e4. There are, I think, 4 main openings these days against the move 1e4. One of which being 1e5, which we've already seen before. 1f6 has fallen a bit out of fashion because it gives up a bit too much space in the center. The other main move I would say is 1c5. I think on the top level between the top grandmasters, they mainly play 1e5 or 1c5. But then there are also other moves. 1c5 is called the Sicilian, and the idea is that we're kind of trying to stop white from going 1d4, because if now white goes 1d4, he is trading a c pawn for a d pawn, which should be a good trade. White is giving up a center pawn for a flank pawn, which in general is a good trade. So black has a slightly better structure already. So by playing 1c5, we're trying to prevent d4, and we can follow this up with d6, knight f6, e6 or e5, bishop to e7. Also, what a setup which I very often like is just to play g6, bishop to g7, where the bishop will be on the long diagonal, and a very harmonious setup. It's a very quick way to see the Sicilian, but that's it basically. It's a very, very interesting opening. It leads some more on the symmetrical positions than one e5, because now pawns are on e4, e5, so very symmetrical, while in the other position we have the pawn on c5. Then there are the two other main openings, one of which is one e6, which recently a course came out on by the one and only Anish Giri. I was recently actually, or 30 minutes ago, I was on his stream on YouTube. He created this series on chessable, which is called, which on the French, the move e6 is called the French. And the idea is to already be able to develop the bishop, but also you want to put the pawn to d5. So what you'll very often see is that we kind of get a reverse King's Indian. So in the King's Indian, we put our pawns on d6 and on e5. But here the plan is to put them on e6 and d5. And now, for example, white pushes, he again has a space advantage. But we want to attack the center with the move c5. So we had this game, or we had this position in King's Indian. I'll go to it quickly. Here. Sorry, I'll go to this position where we are aiming for f5. So here we have this structure of e4, d5 against d6, e5. And we're trying to push for f5 to attack the center. While in the French, we are trying to attack the... Oh, sorry, this one, d4. I wanted to go to e4. We want to attack the center again, but on the other flank. So we're going for the move c5. And we're going to keep on developing our pieces, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. And you can imagine moves like queen b6 next. So this is also a way to play, kind of a reversed King's Indian, I would call it. And also very much a fine opening. So, and let's get to the fourth option, the fourth main option, which is c6. And the idea is basically the same as in the French. We're trying to get a pawn to d5. The whole difference is that the diagonal is still open for the bishop. So basically, for example, what you'll very often see is d4, grabbing space. If white is allowed to play d4, he really wants to. Now d5 and e5, grabbing space again. So you gotta be a bit careful with these openings. If you play it too slowly, you will end up with a space disadvantage. So you should be a bit careful before playing these openings. If you simply play e4, e5, you have the same amount of space as white has. So yeah, you here you do not need to be careful about that. But here we have a slight space advantage, but on the other hand, white has weakened his squares a bit, and we are able to develop our bishop. So again, in this structure, let's say white plays knight f3, we again arise in this structure which we have seen before from the French, but our bishop is suddenly out of the pawn chain, which makes it much more active. So the thing is that even though we've gone c6 and later on we go c5, which is wasting a tempo, we've developed our bishop to a very active square. So we give up a tempo, but get a much more active bishop, so it makes it worth it. And this is also a very respectable opening. So these are a couple of ways to play against 1e4. If you are trying to play 1e5, I would like to note that if your opponent plays this move bishop to c4 instead of bishop to b5, so we had bishop b5 earlier, against which I advise you to play the move a6. Followed by playing bishop f6, knight, bishop to e7. Here, white is going for a different strategy with bishop to c4. And the thing is that usually in the beginning position, so let's go to the beginning position, there is one weak point in the position, and one weak point we need to be careful of. So most pawns are protected by pieces, but the most vulnerable piece is the king. And the pawn on f2 and f7 are the only pawns which is only protected by the king. So those are the points in most positions which are the most weak. So one strategy that, for example, white is very often following, and you need to be careful of in these e5 positions if white plays for this, because he's already targeting f7 once more. These days they play two moves here. One of them is bishop c5, and the other is knight to f6. And you have to be a bit careful. What basically would happen in 80% of my beginning games is, or very, very beginning games, is that we get this type of position and your opponent or yourself plays the move knight to g5. And it seems like white is already winning because there's no good way to protect f7 with a piece. We can protect it with a queen, but it doesn't really help much to our position. White can just take on f7 and we are in a lot of trouble as the knight is entering the position. So yeah, not really great. So instead, there's one move that can kind of save the position here. It's the move d5, blocking the diagonal. And a mistake very often made is to take back with the knight on d5. It seems like a very logical move, just trying to get your pawn back. But the lines are very dangerous here. I think, theoretically speaking, the best move is d4. And already seems like white has having such a huge development lead and a lot of threats already. But the other thing is that also the move knight takes f7 exists. Seems to give away a piece, but after the move queen f3, the only way to protect the knight on d5 is to go king e6. If you go king e8, you just lose a pawn here with a bad position. So you have to play king e6, but these positions are very messy, and I would advise you not to end up in this mess. So what what is much better than taking on d5, not allowing the sacrifice, is to play the move knight a5, attacking the bishop. After bishop b5, we go c6, sacrificing a pawn. D takes c6, b takes c6, getting a tempo on the bishop. And after a move like bishop to e2, we go for h6 and we grab the initiative. Knight has to retreat. We again attack it. Knight to e5 and we go bishop c5 with the idea of going queen d4 next. We can also castle. We have sacrificed the pawn, but we get a lot of development back for it with a very decent position. So this is one thing you have to be careful about, especially as a beginner in chess, not to end up in this mess. Or if you end up in this position, you can just play the move d5 and follow the line which I just showed. The YouTube link will be posted on Chess24's channel, so if you want to look back at that line, you can look back at this video. So one other move they play these days is to go bishop c5 to prevent knight to g5. And what black does now is usually play knight f6, castle, d6, finish development this way. And it becomes a very, very decent position for black with zero trouble really. And very, very fine position. And the thing is that eventually you want to play knight f6, but because you've removed your bishop from f8 to c5, you're one move away from castling, or when you played knight f6. So for example, you play knight c3 here, you play knight f6, and now knight g5 is not a big deal, because you can simply castle. And now suddenly, not only do you bring your king out of the center world, where it will be much safer, the rook is protecting the f7 pawn, and okay, white can still take it, of course. But after rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, white has a very nice position, just because, black has a very nice position. Because in the middle game, two pieces, bishop and a knight, against the rook and pawn should be valued higher. So the bishop and the knight are valued higher than the rook and pawn because it's a middle game. The position is still closed. There is not a single open file for the rook to be on, while our minor pieces are very active in the center. So black is much, much better here. So you can first also develop the bishop and then develop the knight to get your king to safety. Okay, so we've basically covered all grounds. We've got choices against all moves. One thing I wanted to show as well is that after the move c4, I would not advise you to play d5, because this time we get a bad position. Usually you do not want to develop your queen early on in the game. So after c takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, we are in a lot of trouble because d4, e4 is coming. And again, we shouldn't be trading the c pawn for d pawn. So now white has an extra center pawn while we have an extra flank pawn, which is a bad trade. So instead, if you want to go for this setup with the pawn on d5, I would advise you to play the move e6 first. And it's really difficult to prevent d5. So usually what white does in these positions is to go knight c3, and after d5, then d4, and we transpose to this position, which is fine for black. So first play e6 to secure that you're able to play d5. White can try e4, but now after d5, it's not such a big deal. ed5, ed5, cd5, and it seems like we might be developing our queen soon, but we can first play knight f6, capturing back on d5 with a knight to keep the queen on d8. And the problem for white is that he's exchanged the e and the c pawn, which means that he's stuck with his isolated d pawn. So he doesn't really have a nice structure, and black has a very, very fine position here. So there's really no good way to prevent the pawn from coming to d5. And yeah, black's just fine. So we're kind of trying to transpose to that. And the thing is, against one knight f3, you can also kind of go for this setup, because one knight f3 doesn't really prevent you from playing d5. So again, you can just play d5 and have a pawn in the center. So maybe let's have a look at how to play these positions. There's a game which I really like, which it's just too beautiful not to show on stream. It's more of a middle game than of an opening, so I'm not sure if this is the best lecture to show it, but it does show how to continue further. So we had covered this position after knight c3, knight f6, cd5, ed5, bishop to g5, c6, e3, bishop to d6, developing our pieces, bishop to d3, castles, knight to e2, rook to e8, and we had this position, and I want to show how to continue further, because what can very often happen is that this bishop is not allowed to come to an active square, so the bishop on c8, and it's also difficult to find a good square for the knight on b8. So I'm going to show a little bit of middle game, and really a nice model game actually in this structure. Just to finish the stream with a treat actually, let's put it like that. In the game, queen c2 was played. Because the pawn is, the knight is pinned, the pawn on h7 is only defended by the king, really. So white is threatening to take on h7, which means that we play h6 with a tempo on the bishop. White does not really want to give up the bishop pair, so he moves back. And now we play the move a5. So in this structure, what a usual plan for white is to eventually play for a3, b4, going for what's called a minority attack. And by playing the move a5, we're already preventing that plan. And it's hard to find a better or more useful move than a5. And one of the ideas is that we're basically playing a waiting move, so that after the move castles, we can play the very sneaky move. And I'll let you figure it out in chat. If you find the right move here, just type it. There's one very, very strong move here. Yeah, thank you, Prashant, for the compliment. So if you find the right move here, just type it in chat. It's a very common idea, so I don't think it will be very difficult, but it's a nice little idea. Yeah, so the idea in this position is to play the move bishop takes h2. It seems it's called the Greek gift, this idea. And the idea is to lure the king to h2 so that you can remove the knight with check. suddenly opening up the diagonal in the other way. First, white was attacking like this, but now we're attacking the other way. So white is in big trouble here. He has to play king g3, but after g5, we're attacking the bishop once more. The king is on g3, and it will likely get mated. So bishop takes h2 is a nice little combination there. So instead, white should probably play a move like h3 and then castle. And this is also why I wanted to show a little bit of middle game. It's very difficult, for example, to find a good square for this bishop. On e6 or d7 is rather passive, but it cannot really come to f5 or g4 because those squares are covered. Instead here, I will play the move knight to a6, developing your knight. And this is also one of the reasons why we play a5. If you played the move knight a6 on the previous move, then the problem would be to take on a6, and our pawn structure is completely ruined on the queen side. So we do not want this. So we play the move a5, and after h3, knight a6, bishop takes a6, we can just take back with the rook, and our pawn structure is healthy. We have the bishop pair, so a nice position. So white plays the move h3 in this position. Sorry. We play knight a6, and again we are also threatening to knight b4, because that will win the bishop pair, which is something white doesn't really want to allow. So it goes a3 with the idea also to go b4 later on. We play the move castles. Finally, oh sorry, it's black to move. The knight doesn't have a great square, so we move it to c7, and now the idea is to come to g5, and after castles, oh sorry, the arrows won't stop drawing. We play the move knight to e6, and the idea is to go to g5, unpin the knight, and start sacrificing, because now suddenly all of our pieces are pointing towards the king side, and will get very dangerous for white. White can play f3, trying to go for the plan of e4, grabbing space. The idea this time is after e4, de4, we go fe4, and we don't have this isolated pawn anymore, which white doesn't really want to have. For example, if we play the move bishop to d7 here, e4, de4, fe4, white has a nice sender, open f-file, and a nice position, which is why f3 is being played. But we don't play the passive bishop d7, of course. We play the move knight to g5, which was the idea of the very nice knight maneuver. And also the rook is suddenly attacking on e3. We're trying to sacrifice. In this game, white played the most logical move, the move e4, trying to grab the center. But there is a very, very nice move in this position. I'm not gonna ask you to try and find it because it's very difficult. But in this very nice game, the move knight f takes e4 was played. And it's a big shock to white, as we seem to give up a knight at first, which seems like a bad idea, of course. Because white can just take back. However, we've seen this idea before. We had this position with castles. After bishop takes h2, king h2, we had knight g4, opening up the diagonal to the bishop and winning the game. Now we try to use this idea again. After the move knight f takes e4, f takes e4, we play the move knight takes h3, opening up the diagonal for the queen to the bishop. White simply takes back the knight. We take on h4, and suddenly the king is completely wide open. The rook might be entering on the 6th rank. A nice little rook nice little rook lift. The bishop is on this diagonal. The bishop is on this diagonal, so the king is in a lot of trouble here. White played the move rook to f2 here. Black played the move bishop to h3, getting the bishop into the attack. White tried to save the position with rook d1, and black finished off the game here with a very, very beautiful move. I'm gonna ask you to try and find this move, because it's just such a beautiful move, and you should really compliment yourself if you find it. Maybe you've seen the game before. No, this is not Aronian versus Anand. The game is called Moe Senko versus Kasa Curly. Just try to find the best move here. It's gonna be a bit difficult, but you're gonna have to try and checkmate white. So one thing I would like to point out is that the move queen g4, for example, doesn't need to checkmate. White can just play king h1, and it's very difficult to continue the attack here. Probably it's best to go queen h4 back, but then king g1 we have the same position again. So it doesn't really help much to give the check. And also after rook to e6, the problem is e5, blocking off this diagonal and also covering the g6 square. We cannot go rook g6 anymore because it's just gonna get taken. So we still gotta find another move in this position. So what is the best move in this position? Let me know if you found it. It's not gonna be easy. Bishop to g3. No, bishop to g3 is not the correct move. The thing is that the knight is blocking this queen. So if you play knight bishop to g3, you're exchanging a piece and also opening up the second rank for the queen. After king h1, it's very difficult to continue the attack. The right move, however, in the position is the very, very beautiful move, rook to e5. It seems very strange. It seems like it's gonna give away a rook, but after d takes e5, bishop to c5, suddenly the bishop is open. And here, after the move knight to d4, bishop to d4, white is still getting checkmated. He's up a full rook, but there's nothing much to do. In the game, the move that was played was rook to d2, defending the rook. Queen to g3 happened, the rook is pinned, so king h1 is the only legal move. And now the nice move, bishop to g4. And the idea is to go bishop to f3 check. After rook f3, we have queen to g1. There's nothing really to do here. If rook to g2, we can pin the rook. And now we're gonna checkmate white here, because the g1 square is taken. And I think it was in this position that, yeah, I think white still tried to move bishop to f1. But after bishop to f3 check, rook takes f3, queen to g1, it was checkmate. Also here, after bishop f3, bishop to g2. How do we finish off black here? This is going to be the last tactic for today. How do we finish off the game? No, this is not one of Magnus' games. I'm not a Grandmaster, by the way. I'm an international master. I'm actually very close to the Grandmaster title. I was in the Anish Giri stream today. Anish said I should just blame it on the pandemic. So I'm going to do that. If it weren't for the pandemic, I might have been Grandmaster today. But there are no tournaments. And Shiva seems to have found it after bishop g2. There is the move queen to h3 check. The bishop is pinned because of this bishop. So the only legal move is king to g1 after we play the move queen to g2. So this was a very, very beautiful game in this structure. So the setup which the setup which I thought was nice was just developing your pieces, put a pawn on c6, securing your center, developing the bishop to d6 and castle, and just follow the game actually. So yeah, this is how to deal with the opening. Try to put a pawn in the center, and otherwise just develop the knight, get a bishop out, castle your king to safety, and then put a pawn in the center like we did in King's Indian. I've given a lot of options. I hope next time the opening will go a lot better. If you have problems with it, if you didn't have problems, great. But I hope today's coaching session has helped a lot. If you would like more coaching, I'm on Coaches as a trainer. You can also go to other, Coaches for other trainers. And also I have my own Twitch channel, Xamax2000, if you want to follow me there. But I'll be signing off for today. I'll be back next week with another lecture. But you will see me back soon for sure. So yeah, goodbye for today's stream, and hope to